The silence was the worst part. Not the ash that fell like gray snow. Not the skeletal remains of what was once the greatest city on earth. Not even the constant metallic taste in her mouth that reminded her the air itself was poison. It was the silence. Manhattan, a place that never slept, now never woke. Dr. Sarah Chen had survived the initial blast by pure chance, deep in the emergency bunker beneath Mount Sinai Hospital where she'd been cataloging medical supplies during her night shift. The alarms had screamed for 7 minutes before everything went quiet. When she finally emerged 3 weeks later, following protocol, following procedure, following rules that no longer mattered, she found a world transformed into a tomb painted in shades of gray and black. The date was September 23rd, and she was, as far as she could tell, the last living human being in New York City. The first month was mechanical. She moved through the days like a machine, her medical training providing structure when her mind threatened to collapse. Find water. Purify it. Find food. Ration it. Find shelter. Secure it. She established her base in a fortified apartment building in the West Village, choosing the 3rd floor as a compromise between accessibility and defensibility, though she couldn't articulate what exactly she was defending against. The windows she covered with aluminum foil and plastic sheeting, creating a cocoon against the radiation that she measured religiously with the Geiger counter from the hospital. The readings were high but not immediately lethal. She calculated she had perhaps 6 months before the cumulative exposure would begin shutting down her organs. 6 months to exist in this silent world, 6 months to go completely insane. She talked to herself constantly, narrating her actions like a documentary filmmaker recording for an audience that would never watch. Now, I'm opening a can of beans. These beans expired 2 years ago, but in the apocalypse, expiration dates are more like suggestions. The texture is mushy, the flavor is salt and regret, but the protein will keep me alive another day. Her voice sounded foreign in the absolute quiet, too loud and too small at the same time. Sometimes she would scream, just to fill the void, standing at her boarded window and releasing everything inside her until her throat was raw. The city never answered back. By the 2nd month she'd stopped screaming. There was no point in wasting the energy. The dreams started on day 47. In them, the city was alive again, but wrong. People walked the streets with melted faces, their features running like wax, their eyes empty black holes that tracked her movement. They never spoke, just followed, their footsteps silent even in her dreams. She would run through familiar streets made unfamiliar by her subconscious, turning corners that led to impossible places, subway stations that descended into endless darkness, Times Square, where the dead screens showed her reflection multiplied 1,000 times, each one decaying a little more than the last. She would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, and for a blessed moment forget where she was. Then reality would reassert itself, heavier than any nightmare. It was during one of her supply runs that she found the first sign she wasn't alone. She'd been searching a pharmacy on Blicker Street, her face covered with a respirator, her hands gloved, when she noticed it, a can of soup on the floor that hadn't been there during her previous visit 3 days earlier. She stood frozen, her heartbeat suddenly deafening in her ears. Someone had moved it. Someone had been here. Someone was alive. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her surviving, immediately began calculating probabilities. Perhaps she'd knocked it over herself and forgotten. Perhaps the building had settled, shifting the contents. Perhaps she was finally losing her grip on reality and creating false memories, false hopes. But her hands were shaking as she searched the rest of the pharmacy, looking for more signs, more proof that she wasn't the last human on Earth. She found the next clue 2 weeks later, fresh footprints in the ash that coated 6th Avenue, too large to be hers, too recent to be from before. They led north towards Central Park, then disappeared on the pavement. She followed them for hours, her Geiger counter clicking its warning song, her heart hammering with something she'd almost forgotten, hope. But the trail went cold at the park's edge, and she was left standing at the entrance to what was once an urban oasis, now transformed into a dead forest of bare branches and contaminated earth. She called out, her voice cracking from disuse. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, if you can hear me, I'm not dangerous. I'm a doctor. I can help. Please." The wind stirred the ash, and nothing answered. She returned home that night convinced she was manufacturing evidence of life, because the alternative, accepting her absolute solitude, was too crushing to bear. But then came the night of the screams. She was jolted awake by a sound she hadn't heard in months, a human voice that wasn't her own. It was raw, agonized, coming from somewhere outside, maybe several blocks away, maybe the next building over. In the dead city, sound played tricks, bouncing off empty buildings, distorting direction and distance. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and her makeshift weapon, a fire axe she'd taken from an emergency box, and rushed to her window. Through a gap in her coverings, she could see nothing but darkness and ash. The scream came again, and she realized with horror that it wasn't quite human anymore. There was something wrong with it, something that made her hindbrain flood her system with adrenaline and terror. It was the sound of someone in unimaginable pain, someone whose vocal cords were shredding with the effort of their cries. Then it stopped, cut off mid-shriek, and the silence returned, deeper and more menacing than before. Sarah didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat with her back against the wall, the axe across her lap, every sense straining for another sound. When dawn came, gray and weak through her covered windows, she made a decision. She had to know. She had to find whoever had screamed, had to determine if they needed help, if they were still alive, if she was truly alone, or if something worse than solitude was waiting out there in the ruins. She gathered her supplies methodically: water, food rations, her medical bag, a knife, the axe, a handheld radio that picked up nothing but static, her journal in case she didn't return, and someone someday found her body and wondered about her final days. She wrote a single entry. Day 68, investigating source of screams heard during the night. If you're reading this and I'm gone, know that I tried, know that I lasted longer than I thought I would, know that the silence is worse than death. She left the journal on her makeshift table and stepped out into the poisoned world. The streets were a maze of abandoned vehicles, some burned to metal skeletons, others pristine but empty, their doors hanging open, as if their occupants had simply evaporated. Sarah moved carefully, her eyes scanning constantly, her breathing loud in her respirator. The ash muffled her footsteps, and she found herself grateful for the soft silence of her movement. She headed in the direction she thought the screams had originated, toward Washington Square Park, once filled with students and musicians and life, now a crater ringed with toppled buildings. The arch still stood, somehow, a monument to endurance in the face of annihilation. She was standing beneath it, trying to determine her next direction, when she heard it breathing, not her own. Someone else's, ragged, wet, and close. Sarah spun, raising her axe, her heart trying to escape her chest. "Who's there? Show yourself." The breathing continued, coming from behind a pile of rubble that was once someone's home, someone's life. She approached slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she was a doctor, and doctors move towards suffering, not away from it. She rounded the rubble and stopped, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. It had been a man once. She could tell by the build, the remnants of clothing, but the radiation had done something to him, something she'd read about in theoretical papers but never imagined witnessing. His skin was sloughing off in sheets, his body covered in tumors that had grown with impossible speed, his eyes milky white and weeping fluid that steamed in the cold air. He was still alive, somehow, his ruined chest rising and falling, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He had no tongue left, it had dissolved, along with most of his soft tissues. Sarah felt her gorge rise, tasted bile behind her respirator. She was a doctor. She had seen terrible things, but this was beyond terrible. This was a human being unmade, a person transformed into something from a nightmare, and he was still alive, still conscious, still trapped in a body that was killing him in the slowest, most agonizing way possible. His eyes found hers, and she saw recognition there, saw awareness, saw pleading. He wanted to die. He was begging her without words to end it, to grant him the mercy his body refused to give. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently that she nearly dropped her axe. She had taken an oath. First, do no harm, but what harm could be greater than allowing this suffering to continue? What healing could there be for a body this destroyed? What humanity could she offer except release? She knelt beside him, setting down her axe, her hands hovering uselessly above his ruined form. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face behind her respirator. I'm so sorry. I'm a doctor, but I can't fix this. I can't make you better. I can only. She couldn't finish the sentence. She'd never killed anyone. Even now, at the end of the world, with every reason and justification, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she opened her medical bag with trembling hands and pulled out a syringe of morphine. She had a limited supply, had been hoarding it in case she needed it for her own inevitable decline, but this man needed it more. She administered a dose that would have killed a healthy person, then another, emptying her entire stock into his ravaged veins. His breathing began to slow, the terrible rasping growing quieter. His milky eyes found hers one last time, and she saw gratitude there, saw peace, saw the fading of consciousness as the morphine pulled him down into darkness. She held his hand, what was left of it, until he stopped breathing entirely. Sarah sat beside the body for a long time after, her mind blank, her emotions shut down. When she finally stood, she was a different person than she had been that morning. She had crossed a line, had taken a life, had played God in a world where God had clearly abandoned his post. She marked the location in her mind, promising herself she would return to give him a proper burial when she could, though she knew it was a lie. She would never come back here. She would spend the rest of her life trying to forget what she'd seen, what she'd done. She made her way back to her shelter in a daze, not registering the route, moving on autopilot. It was only when she was safely inside, door barricaded, that she allowed herself to break down, sobbing until she had nothing left, until she was empty as the streets outside. The next weeks passed in a blur. She rationed her food more carefully, knowing her supply runs would be fewer now, knowing she couldn't face another encounter like the one in Washington Square. She spent her days reading, rationing the books she'd scavenged from a library. Medical texts, novels, poetry, philosophy. She consumed them all indiscriminately, desperate for voices other than her own, for thoughts that could distract her from her reality. At night, she climbed to the roof of her building, despite the radiation risk, and stared at the sky. The nuclear winter had begun to settle in, and the stars were obscured by ash and debris in the upper atmosphere. But sometimes on clear nights, she could see them, and she would name them, recite constellations, pretend she was anywhere but here. Sometimes she would see lights in other buildings, brief flickers, that could be reflected starlight, or could be other survivors with their own candles, their own desperate attempts to push back the darkness. She never investigated. She couldn't face finding another dying person. She couldn't face the possibility of finding no one at all. It was during one of these rooftop vigils that she saw it, a fire, large and bright, burning in Midtown. Not a random blaze, but something controlled, something purposeful. Smoke rose from it in a steady column, and at its base, she could see shapes moving. People. Multiple people. A group. A community. She watched for hours, her binoculars trained on the distant flames, counting figures. She saw at least 10, maybe more. They had survived. They had found each other. They had created something in the ruins, and she was not included. The rational part of her brain told her to go to them, to join them, to be part of something again. But the part of her that had been alone for 3 months, the part that had adapted to solitude, that had built walls around her heart to keep the pain manageable, whispered that it was too dangerous. What if they were hostile? What if they were sick, like the man in the park? What if they rejected her? What if they accepted her, and she lost them all over again, when the radiation claimed them? She couldn't bear it. She couldn't open herself to that kind of loss again. So she watched from her rooftop sanctuary, and did nothing, but they came for her anyway. She woke one morning to the sound of footsteps in her building, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Her first instinct was to hide, to barricade herself in her apartment, and wait for them to leave. But curiosity, that fundamental human trope that had survived even the apocalypse, made her grab her axe and position herself behind her door, waiting. There was a knock, polite and almost absurd in its normalcy. "Hello." A voice called out, male, rough, from disuse but not threatening. "We saw your light last night. We know you're in there. We're not here to hurt you. We're from the settlement at Rockefeller Center. We're just trying to find other survivors, make contact, share resources. Please, if you can hear us, we'd like to talk. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing. This was what she'd wanted, what she'd dreamed of. But now that it was here, she was terrified. She'd been alone so long that the thought of rejoining humanity felt like exposure, like vulnerability she couldn't afford. She opened the door slowly, her axe visible, but not raised, her respirator still in place. 3 people stood in the hallway, all in makeshift protective gear, all looking as exhausted and damaged as she felt. The speaker was a man in his 40s, bearded and gaunt, with kind eyes. Behind him were 2 women, one young, maybe early 20s, the other middle-aged, both watching her with expressions of cautious hope. "I'm Marcus," the man said, his voice gentle. "This is Elena and Priya. There are 14 of us in the settlement, all survivors, all trying to make it one more day. We have a medical situation, and we heard there was a doctor in this area. Someone saw you with a medical bag weeks ago. Are you?" He trailed off, leaving the question hanging. Sarah found her voice, rusty and small. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm an emergency physician, or I was. What kind of medical situation?" Marcus's face fell slightly. "One of ours, a kid, 15 years old. He was exposed during a supply run. It's been 3 days, and he's deteriorating fast. We don't know how to help him. We were hoping he didn't need to finish." Sarah understood. They wanted her to save him. They wanted her to do what she couldn't do for the man in the park. They wanted her to be a doctor again. She almost said no. Every instinct told her to close the door, to retreat into her solitude, to avoid the inevitable pain of watching another person die, despite her best efforts. But she looked at their faces, at the desperation and hope warring there, and she remembered why she'd become a doctor in the first place. Not to hide from death, but to fight it, even when the fight was hopeless, even when the outcome was predetermined. She nodded slowly. "Take me to him. I can't promise anything, but I'll try." The relief on their faces was almost painful to see. They led her through the ruined streets, moving quickly and efficiently, clearly experienced in navigating the danger. They spoke little, but Sarah absorbed details. They'd formed their settlement in the underground levels of Rockefeller Center, where the radiation levels were lower. They had 16 people, originally, but 2 had died from exposure, and now the boy was dying. They'd survived through pooling resources, through cooperation, through maintaining hope in a hopeless world. They were what she should have sought out immediately, instead of isolating herself. They were humanity's stubborn refusal to end. The settlement was more organized than she'd expected. They'd created a functional community, with assigned tasks, rationed supplies, even an attempt at maintaining records and documentation. They led her to their makeshift medical area, where the boy lay on a cot, his skin already showing the telltale signs of acute radiation syndrome. His parents sat beside him, their faces masks of anguish, their hands clasped in prayer to a God who had allowed the bombs to fall. Sarah examined him carefully, her doctor's mind cataloging symptoms: nausea, vomiting, hair loss, skin lesions, elevated temperature. He was in the prodromal phase, would soon enter the latent phase, where he'd feel temporarily better, then the manifest illness phase where his bone marrow would fail, his immune system would collapse, his organs would shut down one by one. She had no treatments, no medications that could help. She had only truth. She looked at his parents, at Marcus and the others gathered hopefully around. "I'm sorry," she said, and those 2 words contained entire worlds of grief. "The radiation exposure was too severe. His body is shutting down. I can make him comfortable, but I can't stop what's happening. He has days at most, maybe a week if we're lucky." The mother collapsed, her sobs filling the underground space. The father simply stared at Sarah, his eyes accusing, as if she personally had failed them, as if she were responsible for the bombs and the radiation and the death of everything they loved. Sarah understood. She was the doctor, the one who was supposed to heal, supposed to fix things. Learning she was powerless was its own kind of death. She spent the next 5 days with the boy, whose name was David, administering what comfort she could, rationing her limited pain medications, talking with him when he was lucid about everything and nothing. He told her about his life before, about school and friends, and a girl he'd liked but never asked out, about plans for college and career, and a future that would never arrive. She told him about her own life, about medical school, and the impossible hours, and the patients she'd saved, and the ones she'd lost. She told him he was brave, that he'd survived the unsurvivable, that he mattered. She lied, in other words, telling him beautiful lies because the truth was too cruel to speak aloud. When he died on the 5th day, quietly in his sleep with his parents beside him, Sarah felt something inside her break, that she hadn't known was still intact. She stayed with the settlement after David's death, unable to articulate why, unable to find the energy to return to her solitary existence. The community absorbed her, gave her purpose, asked her to be their medical officer, despite her limited supplies and unlimited limitations. She said yes, because she didn't know how to say no, because being needed was better than being alone, because if she stopped moving, stopped trying, she would lie down in the ash and never get up again. She learned their stories, their survival narratives. Marcus had been a high school teacher, had gathered students as the world ended, had tried to save as many as he could. Elena was a grad student, alone when the bombs fell, who'd found the others by following the same fire Sarah had seen from her rooftop. Priya was a nurse, and together she and Sarah formed a medical team of two, stretching their limited knowledge and even more limited resources across the needs of the settlement. They became friends, or something like friends, united by trauma and survival. But the settlement was dying. Sarah could see it in the faces around her, in the increasing radiation readings, in the slow depletion of supplies that couldn't be replenished. They were living on borrowed time, each day a gift stolen from an indifferent universe. People got sick, recovered, got sick again. Food stores dwindled. The water filtration system was failing. They were survivors, yes, but survival wasn't the same as living. They existed in a state of prolonged dying, watching the clock run down, powerless to stop it. Some of the settlement members advocated for leaving the city, for trying to reach areas that might have been spared, that might have lower radiation, that might offer actual hope. Others insisted that leaving was suicide, that their shelter was their only chance, that they should wait for rescue, that everyone knew would never come. The debates grew heated, divided the community, created factions and tensions. Sarah remained apart from these arguments, focused on her medical duties, on maintaining the illusion of purpose. It was Priya who first voiced what everyone was thinking. They were alone in the medical area, inventorying supplies that barely filled a single cabinet. They made it to the George Washington Bridge by nightfall, exhausted and irradiated, their Geiger counters clicking steadily. The bridge was partially collapsed, a testament to the shockwaves that had ripped through the city, but parts of it remained passable. They made camp on the Manhattan side, too tired to attempt the crossing in darkness. Sarah took first watch, sitting with Marcus while the others slept, their breaths visible in the cold air. "Do you think there's anything out there?" Marcus asked quietly, gesturing to the darkness beyond the bridge. "Beyond the city, beyond the blast zones. Do you think anyone survived?" Sarah considered lying, offering comfort, but they were past comforting lies now. "Maybe," she said. "In rural areas, in bunkers, in places far from strategic targets. Maybe scattered groups like ours, trying to survive one more day, or maybe we're it. Maybe we're the last humans on Earth, walking into the wilderness to die with dignity instead of buried in rubble." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I used to tell my students that humans were resilient, that we'd survived ice ages and plagues and wars, that we'd always find a way. I don't know if I believe that anymore." Sarah looked at him. This teacher who'd tried to save his students, this man who'd built a community from survivors and maintained it through sheer force of will. "We're still here," she said. "That counts for something." They crossed the bridge at dawn, moving carefully over twisted metal and crumbling concrete, the Hudson far below, dark and sluggish, probably contaminated. Halfway across, Elena, the young grad student, stopped and pointed. "Look," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. They all turned, following her gaze back toward Manhattan. The sun was rising, weak and red through the contaminated atmosphere, casting the ruins in shades of scarlet and gold. The city, even destroyed, was beautiful in that light, a monument to what had been, a memorial to human ambition and folly. They stood there, all 14 of them, watching the sunrise over the grave of civilization, and for a moment Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sense that bearing witness mattered, that remembering was important, that even if they were the last, even if they died tomorrow, they had seen this. They had survived long enough to watch one more sunrise. That would have to be enough. But the moment passed, as moments do, and they continued north, into New Jersey, through suburbs that looked like they'd been hit by a hurricane made of fire. They found no other survivors, no signs of life beyond the rats that had somehow endured, growing fat on the corpses. They found contaminated water and spoiled food and houses that were tombs. They found evidence of violence, bodies that had died from bullets and blades instead of radiation, proof that humanity's final days had included turning on each other. Sarah cataloged it all in her journal, maintaining a record that no one would ever read, creating a history for a future that wouldn't exist. It felt important. This documentation, it was what humans did. They recorded, they remembered, they bore witness. Even at the end, they insisted on meaning. 3 weeks into the journey, they reached the mountains, and the Geiger counters began to show lower readings. Not safe, but safer. They found a valley with a stream that after filtration approached drinkable. They found a forest where some trees still had leaves, where life persisted despite everything. They found miracle of miracles, a deer, sickly and probably contaminated but alive, proof that the world hadn't ended everywhere, that pockets of survival remained. They made camp there, in that valley, and for the first time since the bombs fell, began to talk about staying instead of running, about building instead of scavenging, about tomorrow instead of today. It was fragile, this hope, built on radiation readings that were merely catastrophic, instead of apocalyptic, on water that would only kill them slowly, on wildlife that was probably as doomed as they were. But it was something, it was a reason to wake up. It was a future that extended beyond the next meal. Sarah threw herself into establishing medical protocols, creating a clinic from their meager supplies, teaching basic first aid to anyone who would listen. She examined everyone, cataloged their radiation exposure, calculated timelines she kept to herself. They were all sick, would all get sicker, would all die within the year. But the year wasn't over yet. They had months, weeks, days. She would fill them with purpose. She would make them matter. The settlement grew, not in numbers, but in structure. They built shelters from salvaged materials, established routines, assigned roles. Marcus taught the younger members, maintaining education even at the end of the world. Elena led foraging parties, mapping the area, searching for supplies and signs of other survivors. Priya assisted Sarah, and together they created a medical system that was part science, part hope, part ritual. They were playing house in the ruins, pretending at civilization, and it was both pathetic and beautiful. And then on day 142, since the bombs fell, day 27 in the Valley settlement, Elena returned from a foraging expedition, with news that changed everything. She'd found others. A larger group, maybe 30 people, established in a facility 15 miles east. They had power, generated from a small hydro station. They had food, stores and gardens. They had medicine, actual medicine, stockpiled from before. They had scientists who understood radiation, who were developing treatments, who claimed they could extend their survival, maybe even ensure it. They had hope, real hope, not the desperate pretend hope the settlement had been clinging to, and they had room for more. Elena had made contact, had been invited to bring the group, had been offered sanctuary. It was everything they'd been searching for. It was salvation, and Sarah didn't trust it for a second. "It's too good," she told Marcus that night, after Elena's announcement had sent the settlement into excited chaos. "Think about it. Power when the infrastructure is destroyed. Gardens when the soil is contaminated. Medicine when everything should have been looted or destroyed. It doesn't make sense. Something's wrong." Marcus looked at her with tired eyes. "Maybe it's exactly what they say. Maybe they were prepared, had a bunker, had stockpiles. Maybe they're just survivors like us, who got luckier. Maybe you're so used to bad things happening that you can't accept when something good comes along." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that miracles could happen even in the apocalypse, that salvation could be real. But her instincts, honed by months of survival, screamed warnings she couldn't articulate. Still, when the settlement voted to make contact, to accept the invitation, She didn't object. She couldn't stand between her people and hope, even if the hope felt false. They made the journey in 2 days, moving carefully, conservatively, led by Elena who'd made the trip before. As they approached the facility, Sarah's concerns grew. It was a former pharmaceutical research complex, high fences and secure buildings, the kind of place that would have been a priority target or a government seizure. Yet here it stood, untouched, operational, thriving. The gates opened as they approached, and people came out to greet them. Clean people in unstained clothes, with healthy complexions and bright eyes, looking nothing like radiation survivors should look. Their leader introduced himself as Dr. Richard Thorne, a biochemist who'd been working at the facility when the bombs fell, who'd sheltered there with his staff, who'd been developing medical countermeasures to radiation ever since. He was charismatic and confident, speaking of treatments and hope and rebuilding. He was everything they needed him to be, and Sarah's skin crawled as she shook his hand. They were given a tour, shown the hydro plant and the gardens and the medical facility with equipment that shouldn't exist, shouldn't function, shouldn't be here. They were offered food, real food, fresh vegetables and protein, not the contaminated scraps they'd been surviving on. They were shown dormitories where they could sleep in actual beds, where they could shower and feel human again. It was paradise, a pocket of the old world preserved in the new. The settlement members were ecstatic, crying with relief, already imagining futures that included tomorrow and next week and next year, all except Sarah, who examined everything with a doctor's eye and a survivor's suspicion, and saw too many things that didn't add up. The equipment was too new, too well maintained for months of apocalypse. The supplies were too abundant, too varied. And the people, the 30 people who'd supposedly been sheltering here since the bombs fell, all looked identical in their health, identical in their demeanor, identical in a way that reminded her of cultists she'd once treated after a mass suicide attempt. She voiced her concerns to Marcus that night, in the dormitory they'd been assigned, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard. Something's wrong here. The people are too healthy, the facility too intact. Nobody survives 4 months of nuclear winter looking like they just came from a spa. And did you notice they all defer to Thorne? They don't make eye contact with anyone else. They don't speak unless spoken to. They move in synchronization. It's not normal. It's not natural. Marcus looked at her with something like pity. Sarah, I know you've been through hell. We all have. But sometimes you need to accept that we got lucky. That we found a place that can help us, that can save us. Not everything is a conspiracy or a trap. Sometimes good things happen. Sarah wanted to believe him. But that night, she lay awake in her comfortable bed in her safe dormitory, and listened. And in the silence between the settlement members' snores, she heard it, a humming low and constant, coming from deep within the facility. A mechanical sound that didn't belong, that suggested something beneath, something hidden, something wrong. She investigated the next day, feigning a need for medical supplies, asking for a tour of the medical facilities. Thorne complied graciously, showing her their pharmacy, their equipment, their research labs, where they were supposedly developing radiation treatments. It all looked legitimate. All seemed real. Except Sarah noticed the security cameras in every room, noticed the locked doors leading to lower levels, noticed the way Thorne's smile never reached his eyes. She asked about the research, about the specifics of the treatments, using technical language to gauge his expertise. His answers were smooth but vague, sounding knowledgeable to a lay person, but revealing to someone with actual medical training that he was improvising, that he didn't really understand what he was claiming to do. He was a fraud. Or worse, he was a liar with a purpose. The question was, what was he lying about, and why? She got her answer on the 4th night, when Priya woke her, terrified.